Let's start things off by changing this pop source. So with the constant birth rate, I'll say something much lower at, let's say 100 for right now. The life expectancy at 0.75, and then the life variance at 0.25. This alone will basically take our particles, make them much, much more sparse, I guess, or just they don't happen as often. And then because of that, we should simulate a lot faster and we end up with something that's about this. Okay, so we have that. That's good. Let's also add a bit of noise, though, to this emission, because I don't want this emitting all the time constantly. It will look a little bit obvious to the trained eye that you just set the settings like this, and it's just not as interesting. So to add a bit of variance, a bit of natural variance to this, let's go to this constant activation and right click and say motion effects noise. And we'll set basically a noise which acts like an on and off switch for this constant activation. Now, if this constant activation is ever a value of 0, that means turn it off. And if it's ever above 0, it's going to say you're allowed to go at this constant birth rate of 100. We don't want to have values that are less than 0, though, because then it might sort of freak out. So on the chop network down here, let's create a limit, which is a way of capping out your values. And actually, the way to do this is you say positive only, so that now we're only going above 1. And then what you do is you clamp this at the minimum of 0. So 0 to 1. Now we end up with something like that. And anytime this flatlines, anytime it's down here, it's basically turning this off. So again, we're just trying to add a bit of variance to this. Let's take the period and bring this down so we end up with something that's a bit high frequency like this. And then that's about all we need right there. It's okay if you go past 1. It's not going to change anything. So just go ahead and, set this to something like that. And if we go back, we'll have something that looks very similar, but when this plays over the course of an animation, it will just break up that animation quite a bit, and it'll look much nicer. Okay, so there is the constant ember activation. Let's create a file cache for this real quick, and we'll call this our Flying Embers. And then under the geo file, as usual, $os, $os, $f4.bgeo.sc. Let's also add another particle simulation over here, which represents those bursts of embers that happen whenever a log moves or whenever, some sort of pop happens in your fire. So let's create a duplicate by holding down Alt and dragging like that. Get rid of the motion effects network in here. So get rid of that. And then let's also go ahead and change the sourcing on this. And for the sourcing, there's a few different ways you can do this. I'm going to do this completely manually. And it just depends on the situation whether or not something needs to be procedural or manual. In this case, I only want a few bursts of embers, so it makes sense just to keyframe that. And on top of that, it's going to solve an interesting problem for us when it comes to where to source this from. So let me show you what I mean. I want to repaint the flame attributes in just one spot. So let's create an attribute paint right here. Go to the attribute name. Let's change this to flame. And then activate the little multi-widget dude over here. Change this shape right here to fill. And then middle mouse so that we start at a value of 0. Now, all I'm going to do to start things off is pick one area that this burst is allowed to happen and just paint that. So the first burst will be right about there. Cool. Once we have that, I'm going to create another attribute paint node. I'm going to repeat this whole thing. So I'm going to say fill, start at 0, volume, pick a different spot now. So let's go maybe over here for the second explosion. We'll do that. And rinse and repeat this for however many times you want to do this. So I'll probably do about 4 or 5 of these. Okay, and once you have this all set up, let's now create a switch node. And with this switch node, we're going to keyframe which one of these gets used. So we'll plug this all in right there. And just as a side note, wouldn't recommend this method if you had a bunch of these little ember explosions happening, but it is convenient in this case, and it's probably the easiest way to do it. So that's why I'm doing it like this. So let's create a scatter. Well, let's just actually make a copy right here. Go like that, and plug this in like so. So that now we have a really concentrated scatter wherever we painted this out. And if we change this input right here, the scatter will change as well. So the idea here is that we want to start, let's say, with input 0, and then perhaps on frame 150. That's going to change. So make another keyframe, next frame, keyframe again. Now we're at 1. And we do the same thing across the board. So don't space this out evenly either. So just pick different areas on the timeline to do this at. Now I'm going to say keyframe 1, next one here, keyframe 2. So now it switches. And then do the same thing for however many inputs you have on that switch. So now if we go to our scatter, we end up with something like this, which is great. Let's go ahead and actually move these keyframes around a bit. I want to leave about 100 frames for the sim to get going. So just hold down Shift, drag out like that with left mouse, and then middle mouse your selection to just scoot those keyframes over. So now we end up with something around here, which is great. On the DOP.NET, the first time I'm going to emit embers is on frame 150. About that. So let's go ahead, turn off this brain icon so it doesn't think about that. And then on the pop source, we'll go to birth, this constant birth activation. On frame 150, we're going to start at 0, keyframe that. Next frame is going to be 1, keyframe that. And then the next frame, again, is 0, keyframe that. So the idea here is that we have nothing, 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 until we hit 150, there's a burst of particles. Meanwhile, this guy switches at frame 230 or so, and then our next keyframe is going to land right here in the middle, which is about 269. So go ahead and repeat this whole process. Keyframe is 0, turn it on for 1 frame, and then turn it back off for each one of the sections. And then just for testing purposes, let's also turn on the emission here for the first frame so that we can see what these particles are doing. So we'll get rid of these frames once we're done, or these keyframes once we're done. But just to test our settings, we're going to add one towards the beginning. Okay, turn back on the simulation right here. So go like that. And now, if you go forward a few frames, we should begin to see something happen. And as you can see, we have one lone particle right there. That's because we need to go here to this constant birth rate and crank this up. So let's say instead of a value of 50, let's try maybe 3,000 and see what that does. All right, now we end up right about there. Go ahead and get rid of those first keyframes that we made. So that's going to be right here. Just Shift, Control, well, actually, just right-click here, go to Keyframe, remove Keyframe, that's Control, left mouse button, and do that for the first few frames. And now we can go back here. We'll merge this in with our original simulation. Create a merge. Go right there, right there. Also be sure that we are merging in anything which says pop, so star, pop, star on both of these. Cache that out and see what it does.